and thanks for hosting us. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Carla Vierteller, and I work with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Today is part one of our Foundations of HUD Coordinated Entry and Housing for Survivors of Sexual Violence. We're so glad you're here with us today. This is a partnership between Collaborative Solutions and NSVRC, and we are excited to be here. Collaborative Solutions and NSVRC are part of the Deviant Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, funded by the federal partners you see on the slide and by the technical assistance providers you see below on that slide as well. We are an organization that works at the intersection of domestic violence and sexual violence and housing to talk through survivors' needs related to housing. We also have a wonderful website, the Safe Housing Partnerships, with all of the information that you see on the slide on that website. We also provide training and technical assistance as requested. A little more about our partners. The National Alliance for Safe Housing is a partner in the consortium. The National Network to End Domestic Violence. NSVRC, as I had shared. Collaborative Solutions. And finally, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. And so today, what we're hoping to accomplish in an hour is to give you an overview and an understanding around the basics of continuums of care, how they're organized, how they operate, who members are, how to access them in your community. And then we also hope to talk you through how the HUD Continuums of Care Coordinated Entry System operates, how it works, how people enter the system, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to keep the introduction brief because I'm hoping that you, like I, am very excited to jump into this information and to really start to understand the basics of how HUD funding works, how housing systems work in your communities. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues, Jill and Sheena, to talk a little bit more about Continuums of Care.
Thank you, Carla, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Sheena Morris. I am one of the collaborative partners with Collaborative Solutions, presenting to you all today along with NSVRC. So it's great to have you all with us today to dive a bit more into this topic. So just before we really dive into talking about the coordinated entry systems, let's take a bit of time to lay a bit of foundation and look at what the definition is of a continuum of care, because it's going to be relevant to our conversation around coordinated entry systems, of course. So the Continuum of Care program is designed to promote a community-wide commitment to the goal of preventing and ending homelessness. This is achieved by providing funding for efforts by nonprofit providers and state and local governments to quickly rehouse homeless individuals and families, while also minimizing the trauma and dislocation caused to them by being homeless. So COCs also promote access to and affect the utilization of mainstream programs such as sexual assault programs, domestic violence programs, and then COCs help to optimize self-sufficiency for vulnerable clients to promote access to and affect utilization of mainstream programs, as I mentioned earlier, by homeless individuals and families, and optimize self-sufficiency among individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, just continuing with our background conversation about what is a continuum of care, looking at how to access information on your local continuum of care. If you go to the link on the HUD Exchange, and we probably can drop that in the chat here, you can see where you might be connected to your local continuum of care. You can find your COC and the respective contacts for that COC. These are going to be based on the geographic location around the country. You can find more information by going also to various HUD links, and there are also resources that can inform you as to whether or not you are part of a balance of state, and you can sign up for COC mailing listservs and so forth. So again, I think, yes, I see that someone just dropped that link in the chat for us. You can see it's at the HUD Exchange. And again, this is the place where you can find your respective COC. If we could go to the next slide. Okay. So the COC program is designed to promote community efforts to prevent and end homelessness, provide funding to rehouse those experiencing homelessness, to promote access to mainstream benefits, such as supportive services around healthcare, child supports, what have you, and to optimize self-sufficiency among individuals and families experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So let's take a look at what is actually required of a local COC. So the COC program interim rule requires that every COC or continuum of care, that they must establish a board to act on behalf of the larger continuum body. The board will be a subset of the membership that is established in accordance with the COC regulations governing board composition and board selection. And the board has the authority, or is given the authority on behalf of the membership of the COC. The COC assigns the board responsibilities in a written agreement, which is usually referred to as a governance charter. So the board doesn't necessarily have this explicit role unless it is specified in that governance charter. Without assigning a duty to the board, the responsibilities are retained by the COC. COC, just to give you all an idea, a COC board might look and act somewhat like an advisory or oversight committee of the COC without the duties being put into that governance charter, as I just mentioned. The COC, let's see, board must be made up of relevant organizations serving persons experiencing homelessness, as you can see here. It requires, again, that interim rule requires that COC boards include representatives from relevant organizations and projects serving homeless subpopulations, such as people with substance use or mental health disorders, people that may be experiencing HIV/AIDS, veterans, those who are chronically homelessness, families with children, unaccompanied youth, and then, of course, victims of domestic or sexual violence, as well as stalking. The board also must include at least one individual who is or who has formerly been homelessness. So again, that's just to provide you all with a little bit of background information about the board makeup of a COC. Can we go to the next slide? And then, so what guides the COC's operations? Again, the COC is guided by the COC interim rule. That is where things are laid out as to the functioning of that COC body. The board sets the local continuum of care goals to end homelessness that guide the local work. So the board has the ability to set the priorities financially, as well as the priorities for what populations may be the population of focus, those who should be served through the coordinated entry system. And then the board also has the ability to impose limits on the funding for the types of projects. So if we can go to the next slide. So to talk about a different role when we look at COC bodies, the collaborative applicant is the eligible entity designated by the Continuum of Care, the COC, to collect and submit the COC registration, the COC consolidated application, and to apply for the COC planning funds on behalf of the larger COC body during the COC program competition. This is often going to be, to this point, a nonprofit organization or a state agency, again, that works on behalf of the larger COC body, and they would be the entity to submit the COC notice of funding availability application, or you may have heard it called the NOFA applications, and the projects on behalf of the larger COC. So you can see that the collaborative applicant has a lot of responsibilities for the COC. The COC may be able to assign additional responsibilities to the collaborative applicant as long as these responsibilities are documented again in that governance charter. And the one thing about the collaborative applicant, they essentially are accountable to the COC board of directors. We can go to the next slide. So the COC funding. So funding for the COC is determined the year before the COC NOFA and is noted by the federal fiscal year, depending on when the appropriations take place. So Congress appropriates funds for HUD for persons experiencing homelessness. And again, normally this is done annually. As I think I mentioned earlier, COCs are established based on the GEO codes, and the COC registers for the COC funding. This is the first step in the annual COC NOFA. Once HUD announces the COC NOFA, the collaborative applicant will then go through a rigorous process to renew and expand the COC funding and housing options. And once the COC NOFA has been released, at that point, organizations are no longer to engage with TA providers to discuss any details around the competition with potential applicants. So after the submission of the NOFA applications, the COC body then waits for the final funding announcement, which will determine essentially who is funded. And there's a lot more kind of in between all of that. We're just kind of really giving you a condensed version. But again, looking back at the HUD exchange and some of the resources that will pop into the chat today will kind of really lay out the full picture of the COC. Next slide. So the COC policies and operations. Each COC board determines the policies for their own COC. Again, HUD does provide guidance, which can be found on the HUD exchange, but that board again determines the policies for their COC. One policy that is specified is around the coordinated entry system. And the coordinated entry system essentially is how people experiencing homelessness are able to access, be assessed, and then be referred for housing resources and services. And so at this point, we're going to look at and dive a little bit deeper into the coordinated entry conversation. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jill.
Great, thank you, Sheena. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jill Robertson. I'm with Collaborative Solutions, and so glad that all of you are joining us today to learn a little bit more about the COC. And I did want to invite everybody to begin, if you'd like, to drop some questions in the chat. I suspect there will be a lot of questions because a lot of this is very HUD-like, and some of it may need some further explanation. So we're going to continue to look at coordinated entry and try to see if we can understand that system a little bit more. So first, let's take a look at the specific definition. This is a HUD definition related to coordinated entry. So it is defined as a process that's developed to ensure that all people experiencing homelessness have fair and equal access to housing resources, It's also a process by which people are assessed and then referred and connected to housing and services based on their unique needs. The reason we want to kind of define a few things before we get too much farther in this is to make sure that you really understand that coordinated entry is sometimes viewed as a thing, but it's really a process. It's a series of steps maybe that people will go through to obtain housing, or maybe to obtain services, or even if they needed like prevention funds, if they were almost homeless but not quite, they would potentially go through coordinated entry. Next slide, please. All right, so a couple other definitions because they do tend to come up around coordinated entry. So the Homeless Management Information System, or the HMIS. Now, this will probably not be a system that any of you that are on the call will be using, but we want you to at least understand what in the world that is, because sometimes we in the HUD world tend to throw these terms around. So the HMIS is actually a longitudinal case management system that's designed to collect client level data. It's utilized at the local COC, specifically around the aggregate data. It helps COCs do their planning. It helps them decide how they should make their coordinated entry processes. So Sheena mentioned about COC boards determining who is funded and also who is prioritized. And that is one way that the Homeless Management Information System can be used to support COCs. I do want to apologize. The timing could not be worse, but I have some guys doing some lawn work, so my apologies if you do hear that in the background. The other definition we just wanted to make sure, and I'm sure most of you all know this definition, but around VAWA, so the Violence Against Women Act, and I believe we're looking at the reauthorization 2013, I believe is the last official, if I'm not mistaken. And that is the US federal legislation that has been expanded over the years to combat violence against women and others that are experiencing violence, that provides protection to women and others who have suffered against various abuses, including violence. So we wanted to just get those definitions out there and make sure that everybody was coming to the conversation the same way and thinking about the same definitions. So let's go ahead to the next slide, please. So we want to talk a little bit about coordinated entry now and just really get into the meat of what coordinated entry is. So the COC board determines the coordinated entry system, and Sheena mentioned this, through policies and priorities. I just want to kind of flesh some of these things out so maybe they'll make a little bit more sense. So what kind of policies would the board have to create? Well, they might determine that the first priority and the first policy would be around how to serve youth, for example. Or maybe the policies could be around how to serve survivors of violence. It depends on the data that the COC is looking at, or maybe just an intuitive sense of who is in need within their community, as far as how those policies and priorities might be established. But the most important part of developing these policies at the COC level for coordinated entry really revolves around what the community needs. So the community should be speaking into the policies and helping design what the policies and practices might be. That doesn't always happen, but this is an opportunity for you all as you get involved with your local continuum of care to help craft and shape the policies and practices around coordinated entry. The other thing to know is that the COC is actually required to host an annual coordinated entry training. They're also required to evaluate their system and to really make sure that the changes and things that are necessary for consumers and the community are taken into consideration. So just to be concise on that, that's an annual thing. And annually, the COC should be providing training, and they should be evaluating their system to make sure that they're really serving the audiences that are popping up or need to be served within their local community. So I think somebody asked in the chat a while back how they could be involved. So at the COC level, COCs are actually supposed to have members. They're required really to have members. That's so you and I could each be a member of a local continuum of care, and our voice as a member should be heard, that we speak on behalf of the community, and maybe we speak on behalf of the people that we serve in our programs or in programs that we know of. So each one of us or each community voice is very important in terms of the policies and the programs that are designed at the local level to end homelessness. So some of you might be wondering a little bit about whether your clients would be considered homeless if they are experiencing sexual violence. In some cases, yes, they might be. If they have to flee a violent situation or they're displaced in some way, then I would believe that they would be considered homeless under category 4 definition, which I think we'll talk about, but possibly not today. All right, let's move to the next slide, please. All right, a little bit more about coordinated entry and the housing referrals. So people experiencing homelessness go into the coordinated entry process and system, and they're assessed, whether that is a verbal assessment or through a tool such as the VI SPDAT, which a lot of COCs are moving away from. So hopefully some more trauma-informed, person-centered assessment processes are being done in the local COC. But during that assessment process is when a person might receive a referral to a housing option or maybe to services or something else that would support them and their unique needs. Any COC affiliated agency can receive referrals. So your programs, if you have, if you're serving sexual assault, sexual violence survivors, then you might be able to receive referrals. Not necessarily for housing, but your services are incredibly valuable, and we really want to see you be connected to the coordinated entry system and also the COC. COC funded projects are required under the HUD funding rules to participate in coordinated entry. But that doesn't preclude anyone that is not HUD funded from being a part of the COC or a part of the coordinated entry system to receive referrals or to give referrals. So sexual assault, sexual violence programs can make and receive referrals to housing through coordinated entry, and also services is another thing we should add there. All right, next slide, please. One thing I wanted to mention is that I know that I talked a little bit about the homeless management information system, and it's listed here on this slide, but I did want to mention that if any of you would apply for funding and receive funding under the HUD COC program, then you would be using something called a comparable database. So it would be, quote, comparable to the HMIS in that it would be able to collect client level data and then produce aggregate level reports. You would not be sharing client level specific PII, but rather you would be sharing how many people possibly you served, or how many people lived within a certain geographic area, those kind of pieces of information. Again, not client level data. So let's talk about what projects are funded through the COC. So there's quite a few different projects that can be funded. And as you might recall, as Sheena was mentioning, the COC board actually determines which of these project types can be funded within their local continuum of care. So there's permanent supportive housing, it's also known as PSH. And we'll talk a little bit more about these particular projects as we move along. There's also rapid rehousing, also known as RRH. There's transitional housing, and that is, the acronym for that is TH. Actually, let me briefly touch on what these components are. So the permanent supportive housing is just that. It's permanent housing, but it does have supportive services attached to it. We'll talk about that in more detail, but I feel like we should touch on what in the world these things are so that you know a little bit more. So rapid rehousing is something you may have heard a lot in your local community. It's very popular right now, and a lot of the funding that's come out from our federal government is involves rapid rehousing. So rapid rehousing is usually considered short to medium term housing. It is considered permanent housing, but it doesn't last forever. So for example, some clients with disabilities or maybe longer term needs would be able to apply for and get into permanent supported housing. Whereas with rapid rehousing, maybe someone lost their job, or maybe they just need short-term assistance to stay housed, and they might go into rapid rehousing. Transitional housing is also considered medium-term housing. It is usually a type of housing that people maybe were in shelter and then they transition to a longer term housing that's their own apartment, for example, or part of a large complex, but it's a place where they can go for a period of time to gain the skills that they need to become self-sufficient and then eventually move into more permanent housing. The joint component, transitional housing and rapid rehousing, is kind of a combination of the transitional housing, so something that they would be in for a short period of time, and then they would move into a more permanent housing under the rapid rehousing. That is something you see in some communities around clients that have substance abuse needs, and also possibly those that might be serving domestic violence clients. Then there are just a few more projects that are served under the COC. There is something called a supportive service only project. Those projects are few and far between anymore just because of funding restrictions and limitations, but some COCs do have only supportive services available in certain projects. Coordinated entry is funded under the COC, and then the homeless management information system is also funded as part of the COC. And that's a whole lot of words. So let's move on to the next slide, and please feel free to drop in any questions that you might have. So one of the most important things we want to talk about today is just encouraging you to build your own relationship as an organization and as people that are serving clients that experience sexual assault or sexual violence. We really want to encourage you to start building your relationship with your local continuum of care. So what does that look like, and what does that really mean? Well, we want you to learn about the COC. We want to invite you, even though we can't give you a personal invitation to your local continuum of care, we're giving you kind of an indirect invitation to be a part of your local continuum of care. Go to those meetings. We'll first find out when they are and go to those meetings. If you can't attend, maybe one of your staff members or your partners in crime, so to speak, would be able to attend, but send somebody so you know what's happening, so you know what's available to your clients. Become a member of the COC. Normally, there is no money involved in becoming a member. Sometimes there might be a small membership fee, but being a member of the COC allows you to have a voice to encourage funding for your member programs, to receive HUD funding. Also, you can be an agency that participates in the coordinated entry system. That specifically would mean that you would take referrals from the coordinated entry system, and also you would provide them as well. So maybe some of the clients that you're supporting need housing, and this would be a great way for you to make a referral to the coordinated entry. All right. Then a little bit more on building the relationship with the COC, and that is just get involved in committees. There are lots of committees at the COC level, whether that's governance or sometimes there's a focus on serving veterans, serving survivors at committee levels, serving youth, all kinds of opportunities, and we just encourage you to get involved in the committees that are available in your local community. And stay involved. I can tell you from my own personal experience, I've been involved with COCs for quite a few years, and it can be a bit painstaking at times. Sometimes we talk about the same thing an awful lot, and we don't seem to move forward. But if you stay involved, you're going to learn a lot, and also you're going to have some opportunities to really shape the policies and practices that are happening at your local community level. So those are just some small ways that you can begin building your relationship with the COC. And let's go to the next slide. All right, well, I have talked for a very long time, or so it seems, and we just want to invite questions now. We also want to let you know that we do have this website that you can go to, the safehousingpartnership.org website. You can request support if you need some sort of technical assistance, and we're able to do a lot of different types of technical assistance. If we can't do it, we have partners that are able to do technical assistance or possibly around something that you might need. And we want to invite questions now. So I'm going to put myself back on mute and let Louie come forward and share any questions that you all might have, and we'll try to get those answered for you.
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Louie Marvin from the NSVRC. I think I joined maybe right as introductions were happening. I was restarting my computer, so sorry if I missed any introductions, but we did have a few questions in the chat, so thanks. And I know that Sheena's been answering some of them as well. So Mark was wanting to know how human trafficking organizations partner with COCs. So I wonder maybe if anyone had an example of how that might work, or how you imagine human trafficking organizations might partner with COCs.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. Sheena, feel free to jump in, or Carla, either one. I think one of the best ways is really just beginning to participate in the coordinated or the COC, whether it be a committee or just learning about the COC at your local level is probably one of the best ways. When it comes to the funding, it is a competitive process at the COC level for anyone that wants to receive funding. And so if you go to the meetings and you learn a little bit about the priorities, and you also help shape those priorities and help the COC realize that survivors of human trafficking need housing funding, then that would be a great opportunity to submit an application and apply for funds. I think the biggest way for anyone that wants to receive funding and build a relationship with the COC is just to jump in there and attend meetings and just help shape the policies and practices that are happening. I think sometimes the COCs don't always know that there's a need, and this in human trafficking and survivors that are experiencing sexual assault and sexual violence, they may not always be top of the mind for everyone. So it's good for you to be a voice and bring that to the COC's attention. Gina?
Yeah, so like you were saying, Jill, there are those opportunities to engage when there may be board meetings or member meetings where there may be a portion of the meeting that is open to the public if you are not a member. So that's an opportunity to engage. But then there are also times where your COC may put a call out on something in particular for public comment. So that may be another way to kind of engage and share what the needs of human trafficking survivors are. And hopefully be able to open that door so that you can loop back and perhaps follow up. So that may be another strategy and way to engage with your COC.
Thanks, Jill and Sheena. There is a really good back and forth that has gone on in the chat that I just want to highlight. So Christine had asked about some kind of local information to Phoenix, and then Sheena posted a link to where people can search for their COC locally. So I hope everyone grabbed that link. That's a really useful link if you don't know what your local COC is. And then Christine followed up and said, it says that there are board meetings and that look open to the community. Should we go to those? Can we go to those? And Jill chimed in to say yes. So I wonder if anyone wanted to add anything or reflect on that besides, yes, definitely look up your COC and definitely attend those meetings. Would you add anything or reflect on anything to do with how to engage on that level?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's, for any of us, even for those of us who would be extroverts, it can be difficult to attend these meetings kind of out of the blue and when you don't know anybody. But what you could do is possibly reach out to the board president or to one of the officers that might be listed on the HUD exchange. I'm not quite sure how that's listed anymore, but typically COCs do have to have a website, so you should be able to find out some of the contact people. So maybe reach out to them and let them know you're interested in coming to a meeting, and then hopefully find out when it is and show up. I think it's going to be challenging just because it's something new and different, but still really a great opportunity. And we just want to encourage your voice to be heard within the local community.
Yeah, and on that link that I listed, if I'm not mistaken, it will note who the lead point of contact may be for the COC, as you were mentioning, Jill. And yeah, that information should be on there. And I'll say that the COC body, they want to hear and be in relationship with organizations, especially those that are serving survivors, right? Because you all are the experts on how to best serve survivors, what the needs are, and essentially your input informs the entire community response. So look at it from that vantage point, as well as being, a resource to the community overall.
Great, thanks, Gina. Thanks, Jill. Yeah, we've got a few questions and some follow-up questions too. So Brittany was wondering earlier, what's the typical course of action when there isn't much available by way of affordable housing? So I think this had maybe some to do with what Jill later shared about the different forms of housing and services that might be available. So yeah, would you add anything to that, Sheena and Jill?
I'm going to jump in there and just say the affordable housing overall I got to tell you, I was on this conversation last night, totally different context, but the point that really came up was there's no affordable housing, and it doesn't matter whether it's like affordable, attainable, or any kind of housing. It doesn't really exist right now. So the market is extremely tight. The good news is that for anyone, especially right now, the federal government has the American Rescue Funds that are out there, and also the EHV funds that are out there as well. So there's a few opportunities for people to get funding, at least for these housing types. But the thing I really wanted to mention is under the American Rescue Plan, there will be an opportunity for development of affordable housing. I realize this is a big ask, but if you know any builders or if you can get connected to anyone that does affordable housing, this is a golden opportunity, and probably one that won't come around anytime soon again. So partnering with some of those builders and developers to build affordable housing is a really great opportunity. And I think there are some developers that are poised to step in that gap and start filling the need. But we need to let them know that we're interested. So it is a big need across the country. There isn't really a lot of affordable housing available. So it's definitely an issue. And Sheena, do you have any other magical solutions?
I don't. Like you said, there are many other resources to engage in conversations with partners around that could build overall housing inventory.
Thanks. Yeah. So again, we have a couple more questions. So again, this was something that Sheena answered in the chat, but I wonder if anyone had anything more they wanted to say. Hannah was clarifying, can organizations also be members of the COC or only individuals? And so Sheena said that, yes, organizations like sexual assault programs, DV providers, homeless service providers are the COC members. So, so thanks for answering that in the chat, Sheena. I wanted to lift that up. And did anyone have anything they wanted to add about that? Just to be clear about like who's a member, how does it work? These organizations come together. Anything more on that?
Just for clarity, and it is not totally clear. So if you go to the HUD COC regulations and try to learn something about a member, it's almost, I mean, you find maybe 1 or 2 sentences. Most COCs have interpreted a member being an individual or an organization that represents a specific audience. But you can be, so I can remember in our COC, we had members of the community that were owned businesses, and they were part of the COC, and actually their voice was incredibly helpful because they brought a slightly different perspective to the table in terms of why affordable housing and why helping people that were experiencing homelessness was so important. So they were really invested in a different kind of way. So really anyone or any member of an organization can be a part of the COC. So it's kind of defined loosely in terms of membership. However, each COC should define clearly what a member is. But I'm going to tell you, not every COC has gone to that length to explain specifically what their membership is. So if it's not clear, please ask, and it will help shape the policies again at your local level to define who a member really is. It's a very important question.
We had a question about, can you explain category 4 and if a victim must meet all of the criteria? And so Danielle is saying that they're looking at the Phoenix COC meeting. Yeah, I'm sorry. So I'm not sure about the second part of the message, but can you explain category 4 and if a victim must meet all of the criteria?
As far as if the individual is, so looking at category 4, the individual or a family who is fleeing or attempting to flee domestic or sexual violence, they would have no other option or residence that they are able to locate to. And then there's the they also would lack those support networks or additional resources that would help them to obtain or maintain housing. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, Gina. Danielle, will invite you to follow up in the chat if you had more questions about that. And I'm pasting a link from our colleagues at NMEDV a little bit more about category 4. Okay, yes, thank you. So thanks, Gina. We had a question from Ariel. Can a DVSA agency do their own coordinated entry for survivors? Is this something that is decided within the local COC? So maybe a little bit more about, Jill, what you were sharing about the databases and the different referral processes.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, actually, any kind of victim service provider, whether they're domestic violence, sexual assault, sexual violence, or human trafficking, yet they could conceivably do their own coordinated entry processes. So the thing that's complicated about that is there are a few COCs in our country that have figured out how to do that smoothly, but it seems to be still an evolving process. So if you're interested in taking the lead on that, I so encourage you to do that. There are a few things I can tell you about how that might look that we know, but I think you could bring creativity to this space and maybe help shape the practices that are happening around the country. So one thing, so there's probably 3 approaches to coordinated entry for survivors. One is they could be incorporated into the larger coordinated entry system, but the caveat around that is that you really can't share, if you're a victim service provider, you can't share any PII. So you have to have releases and you have to have a way of identifying the survivor without identifying the survivor. So whether that's a number or some sort of anonymous something or other, so that survivor is actually in line for housing. So in coordinated entry, when somebody goes through the assessment process, whatever that looks like, then based on their unique needs, they kind of either get housing immediately because it's readily available, or they get on some type of process, wait list. Kind of hate to use those words because I don't really even like those, but typically most communities don't have enough housing that's readily available. So there is some sort of process that people have to wait for a period of time, possibly. So that's one way. Another way with coordinated entry is to do a parallel system. So you have your homeless service providers kind of going through their own processes around coordinated entry, and then the victim service providers have their own process, but yet at the end it still comes together and the survivors on a list or gets immediate housing depending on the resources. And then the last way is to do them both mostly independent. So the victim service providers have their own funding, they have their own processes, they have policies, and they work to make sure that survivors are housed. So those are the three ways that we are aware of that have occurred around the country. None of them is fabulous, but none of them is necessarily bad or a wrong approach. I think you could bring creativity to the table and possibly do some other things, but those are the systems that we know of. Would anybody else add anything to that?
I think the only thing I would add, Jill, and this kind of connects to one of the questions that's in the chat about funding, is the COC funding just for HUD funding, or are there other specific VAWA or other resources? When you mentioned the wait list sometimes that communities have, and how there may be opportunities or resources through those other funding streams, such as your VAWA or your VOCA, particularly VOCA, to be able to provide housing supports and resources when there is that waiting period or that gap, especially in situations where the survivor may be in more immediate danger, or there are kind of higher risk that may be involved if they aren't rehoused quickly. So looking at that braiding of resources and funds.
Great, thanks Jill, thanks Sheena. We had a couple questions about getting this information. Will the PowerPoint be shared? Can we share the PowerPoint in the chat questions and answers for folks on the phone? So I assume since we're recording, we'll be sharing the recording that will also have the chat in it. Am I correct about that? Okay, I see Jill nodding yes. We have another question from Mark saying, does the CES cost for nonprofit organizations? So I'm assuming we're talking about things like infrastructure and databases and things like that, or maybe beyond. But Sheena and Jill, would you talk about that?
Yeah, Jill, you might be able to speak to it a little more broadly, especially on the comparable database side of things. So that would be something that would incur a cost when you talk about coordinated entry systems. It would be that comparable database piece that is a part of kind of the coordinated entry system process. But again, to just point back to the point that Jill mentioned earlier, think about coordinated entry systems not necessarily as like this thing that's on a computer or what have you, but it is the actual process of how people access and are assessed for housing resources, prioritized and referred. So that is the overall process where within that process, the comparable databases, software, those are the things that would have some incurred cost. Jill, would you add anything or clarify?
Yeah, you're spot on. In theory, the coordinated entry process does not cost somebody per se. However, you do have staff involved with that, so there are going to be some expenses associated with that. Mark, if you were asking about the software, yes, it is not free, unfortunately. I would be more than happy to talk about that in greater detail, but I'll try to give you the bullet points on that. You really want to shop around if you're going to get a comparable database. One of the best things I can suggest would be to go to the HUD Exchange and to go to some of the contract management sessions that have been recorded and are readily available. That might sound like a strange thing to direct you to, but the biggest thing when it comes to any kind of vendor software, whether it's HMIS, comparable database, or some other type of software that you need, is for you to figure out what you need in your contract. What do you need in a comparable database? Do you need all the bells and whistles? If so, you want to put that in writing and make sure that the vendor gives you assurances that they will deliver on that. We see an awful lot of people that don't have good contracts and quite frankly get taken advantage of. So please do your due diligence when it comes to contract management, and we're happy to help you with that, to talk through some of the things that you might want to look for, but shop around and see what kind of quotes you can get before you settle on a particular vendor. Even if other victim service providers say that it's fabulous, it might not be fabulous for you for a variety of reasons. One, you might not need all those bells and whistles. Two, maybe it's not a cloud-based program. So many different things. So please do your due diligence on seeking out a software.
And Jill, I'd say that also kind of points back to the important point around the relationships, developing and building those relationships with your COC, because thinking about how the HMIS lead is, a part of that COC body and someone to be in relationship with as well, and how they could be a critical resource when looking at a comparable database and selecting that and the requirements and so forth.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So one of the things that happens in your COC is they have somebody or an organization that's designated as the HMIS lead, and they can certainly be a huge resource to help you. And really having a good relationship with your HMIS administrator, it's very valuable and important. They can help answer questions that might not typically be something that you would know to think about or to ask a vendor about. They really can be one of your best friends. So just encourage that relationship building. So one other kind of follow-up, I see Mark is asking about referring to the COC without a CES. So the way the system can work is that if you are a provider and you're not currently a part of the coordinated entry process, you still can give a referral to the COC, or you can take one. But it is something you will have to work with your COC to let them know you want to be a referral agency or give referrals, because there's usually some nuances to how that's done. But that's a great question.
Well, thanks everyone for your questions. And I think there was some good interaction in the chat too, just some comments. Christine mentioned a foundation funding source, the Parsons Foundation, that's helping with some tech and software. So that might be a good resource for others too. Thanks for sharing that, Christine. Jennifer had shared, we're a dual DVSA program with TH and RRH programs. Our COC has decided we could do coordinated entry for our clients. So, so thanks everyone for sharing about your own experiences and responses in response to others' questions. And it looks like that's all the questions that are in the chat. Thanks so much, Sheena and Jill, for answering those. Any final comments from you both, or Carla?
I just want to mention, Louis, there was one question about the timeline for EHVs, which, in some ways is connected to this conversation, but a larger conversation as well. And so communities are looking to finalize their MOUs with their PHAs, public housing authorities, by the end of this month. So again, talking about that relationships building piece right now is a critical time to be engaging with your COC, as there is coordination around those emergency housing vouchers happening with the COCs as well as victim service providers. So again, it just goes back to reiterate that the importance of the relationship building piece so that survivors have access to the array of resources that may be available, whether they are COC focused and concentrated or in other areas under HUD.
And I would just say thank you all for coming. I know I have, this has answered a lot of questions for me. I'm continuously learning about the housing world. And thank you both, Jill and Sheena, for sort of sharing so much with us today. I do want to share for sexual assault programs, often if you are not a dual program, meaning a DVSA program, the domestic violence program in your community might be a great resource in terms of learning more about COC and HUD funding and the coordinated entry process and what that looks like in your community. I know here in Pennsylvania, we've leaned heavily on our Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. As someone there has applied for HUD funding for domestic violence programs across our state. So just wanted to share that as a, another potential kind of gatekeeper to COCs and someone who can potentially walk you through the process. And I just also wanted to plug our next webinar in July. We really hope you will be there and continue learning with us. And I think that's it. Thank you, Louie, for handling the Q&A so graciously. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.